It is August 23rd, 1305, and London has awakened to witness an execution that will echo through the corridors of history. The crowd grows thicker by the hour, merchants abandoning their stalls, nobles descending from their chambers, common folk streaming in from every corner of the city. They come not for bread or ale, but for blood. They have come to watch a man die in the most horrific way their twisted imaginations can conjure. In the distance, you can hear it, the scraping of wood against stone, the clip-clop of hooves, and something else, something that makes your stomach turn. It's the sound of flesh being dragged across rough cobblestones, leaving a trail of crimson breadcrumbs for the ravens to follow. The crowd parts like a diseased sea, and there, bound naked to a wooden hurdle, being pulled behind a horse, is William Wallace, the man who dared to dream of a free Scotland, now reduced to raw meat being delivered to the slaughter. His body is a map of England's fury. Every stone on the 400-mile journey from Scotland has left its mark. His skin hangs in ribbons, his back is a checkerboard of wounds, and yet his eyes, God help us all. His eyes still burn with defiance. Even now, even as the crowd spits and throws filth at his broken form, William Wallace refuses to break. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy discovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it amazing that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the horror that awaits Wallace in these final moments, we must journey back 35 years to a Scotland that once knew peace. The year is 1270, and in the rolling green hills of Renfrewshire, a child is born to Sir Malcolm Wallace, a minor landowner whose greatest aspiration is to tend his fields and serve his lord. They name the boy William, never suspecting that this infant will one day have the most powerful king in Europe baying for his blood. Young William grows tall and strong in the shadow of the Scottish Highlands. He learns to read and write, a luxury for most men of his station, studies Latin with the monks, and develops a mind as sharp as any blade. But it's his physical prowess that sets tongues wagging. By his 20th year, William Wallace stands nearly 6.5 feet tall, a giant among men, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a nation's hopes and hands, powerful enough to wield a 6-foot sword with deadly precision. Scotland in William's youth is a realm blessed by peace. King Alexander III rules with wisdom and strength, and the land prospers, markets bustle, harvests flourish, and the people sleep soundly in their beds. But fate, that cruel mistress, has other plans. In 1286, on a storm-lashed night that seems torn from the pages of prophecy, Alexander III rides his horse over a cliff near Kinghorn. With his death, Scotland's golden age crumbles to dust. The throne passes to Margaret, the Maid of Norway, a 3-year-old child who has never set foot on Scottish soil. For 4 years, the realm hangs in precarious balance, ruled by regents and riddled with intrigue. Then, in 1290, young Margaret dies during her voyage to claim her inheritance. Scotland finds itself without a king, without direction, and about to make a decision that will drench the land in blood for generations. Enter Edward Longshanks, Edward I of England, a man whose very nickname speaks to his imposing physical presence. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Edward is a warrior king who has spent his life conquering. Wales has already felt the crush of his iron fist, and now his hungry eyes turn north to Scotland. When the Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war, invite him to arbitrate between the competing claimants to their throne, they unknowingly invite the wolf into the fold. Edward's choice is John Balliol, a weak man whom the English king believes he can control like a puppet on strings. But Edward's ambitions extend far beyond king-making. He demands that Scottish nobles pay homage to him directly, that Scottish legal disputes be appealed to English courts, and that Scottish knights serve in his foreign wars. Each demand is a tightening noose around Scotland's neck. By 1296, even the spineless Balliol can tolerate no more humiliation. He attempts to assert Scotland's independence, forming alliances with France and renouncing his vassalage to Edward. The English king's response is swift and merciless. His armies pour across the border like a plague of locusts, and the first city they encounter, Berwick-upon-Tweed, becomes a testament to English fury. The sack of Berwick is so thorough, so absolute in its brutality, that it sears itself into the Scottish national consciousness. Edward's soldiers don't merely defeat the defenders, they butcher every living soul they can find. Men, women, children, infants, still suckling at their mothers' breasts, all fall beneath English steel. The chroniclers speak of rivers running red, of bodies stacked like cordwood, of a silence so complete that even the ravens refuse to sing. 17,000 souls perish in a single day, their only crime being born on the wrong side of an invisible line. This is the Scotland that shapes William Wallace. This is the crucible of fire and blood that forges his steel-hard resolve. When Edward strips Baliol of his crown and crown jewels, forces him to perform public penance in his undergarments, and declares himself overlord of Scotland, young William watches from the shadows. When Scottish nobles bend the knee and sign the Ragman roll, swearing fealty to their conqueror, William's jaw tightens with disgust. When English administrators begin parcelling out Scottish lands to their cronies, treating the proud kingdom like spoils of war, something fundamental breaks inside the young giant from Renfrewshire. The spark that ignites Wallace's rebellion comes in May 1297, and like so many moments that change history, it begins with something small and personal. The exact details are lost to time. Perhaps it was the murder of his beloved Marion Braidfute, as later poems claim. Perhaps it was simply witnessing one injustice too many. But when William Wallace draws his sword against William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark, he crosses a line from which there can be no retreat. The killing of Heselrigg sends shockwaves throughout occupied Scotland. Here, finally, is a man willing to spill English blood. Here is someone who refuses to bow, who looks at Edward Longshanks's seemingly invincible war machine and says, "No more." The response is immediate and electric. Men begin disappearing from their fields and workshops, slipping away into the forests and hills to join Wallace's growing band of rebels. But William Wallace is no mere bandit chief. He possesses something that transforms scattered resistance into organized rebellion. A brilliant tactical mind coupled with an unshakable belief in Scotland's right to freedom. When he speaks to gathered crowds, his voice carries the weight of divine conviction. "We fight not for glory or riches," he thunders, "but for freedom alone, which no good man loses but with his life." The autumn of 1297 brings Wallace face to face with the full might of English power at Stirling Bridge. The odds are horrific. Perhaps 6,000 Scots against 15,000 English troops, including the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The English commanders, John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham, are so confident of victory that they treat the battle as little more than a training exercise. They watch from across the River Forth as Wallace and his co-commander Andrew Moray position their forces on the high ground of Abbey Craig. What follows defies every military textbook of the age. Wallace waits with the patience of a spider as the English begin crossing the narrow bridge. The crossing takes hours. Cavalry, infantry, baggage trains all funnel across the slender span in a long, vulnerable column. Any conventional commander would attack immediately, but Wallace understands something his enemies do not. Timing is everything. When exactly half the English army has crossed, Wallace gives the signal. The Scots pour down from the heights like an avalanche of death, their war cries echoing off the water. The English, caught with their forces split by the river, cannot bring their superior numbers to bear. The bridge becomes a bottleneck of terror, as fleeing soldiers trample their own comrades in their desperation to escape. Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, and a man hated for his cruelty and greed, falls early in the fighting. The Scots, in a gesture that speaks to their seething rage, flay his corpse and fashion his skin into belts and purses, a grotesque trophy of their victory. By day's end, the supposedly invincible English army lies shattered, and William Wallace has achieved the impossible. The victory at Stirling Bridge transforms Wallace from rebel to national hero overnight. He is appointed Guardian of Scotland, the kingdom's de facto ruler, and for a brief shining moment, it seems as though David truly has slain Goliath. Wallace leads raids into northern England, returning the brutality visited upon Scotland with interest. English civilians flee their homes as Scottish warriors torch everything in their path. The psychological impact is devastating. If William Wallace can defeat England's finest, what other impossibilities might come to pass? But Edward Longshanks is no ordinary adversary. The man who conquered Wales, who has spent his entire life in warfare, who earned his fearsome reputation on crusade in the Holy Land, does not forgive such humiliation. He abandons his campaigns in France, recalls his finest knights, and begins assembling an army whose sole purpose is the complete and utter destruction of William Wallace. The two forces meet again at Falkirk on July 20, 1298, and this time the English king takes no chances. He has learned from Stirling Bridge, has studied his enemy's tactics, and brings overwhelming force to bear. Wallace, for all his tactical brilliance, cannot work miracles. His army, largely composed of spearmen with little training, faces the cream of English knighthood backed by Welsh longbowmen whose arrows can pierce armour at 200 yards. The battle is a massacre. The Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen with pikes pointed outward like giant hedgehogs, hold firm against the English cavalry charges, but they cannot protect themselves from the arrow storm that rains down from above. Welsh longbowmen, positioned with surgical precision, pour thousands of arrows into the packed Scottish ranks. Men fall by the hundreds, their screams lost in the thunder of hoofbeats and clashing steel. When the schiltrons finally break, the English cavalry pours through like water through a cracked dam. John de Graham, Wallace's closest friend and most trusted lieutenant, dies fighting to the last, his body pierced by dozens of wounds. The Scottish army disintegrates, leaving the field carpeted with their dead. Wallace himself barely escapes, his dreams of independence seemingly crushed beneath English steel. Falkirk marks the beginning of Wallace's darkest chapter. Forced to resign as guardian, abandoned by nobles who now see him as a liability rather than an asset, he becomes a man without a country. Some sources suggest he travels to France, seeking support from Philip IV in his struggles against Edward. Others place him in Rome, pleading Scotland's case before Pope Boniface VIII. What we know for certain is that William Wallace becomes a ghost, a legend whispered about in taverns but nowhere to be found. Years pass. Other men take up the banner of Scottish resistance. Robert the Bruce, once a collaborator with the English, begins his own campaign for the crown. John Comyn, Wallace's rival for leadership, makes his own accommodations with the occupiers. Scotland's nobility, ever pragmatic, adapts to the new reality of English rule. But Edward Longshanks does not forget. He cannot forget. Somewhere in the shadows lurks William Wallace, the man who humiliated him at Stirling Bridge, and until that man is dead, England's victory remains incomplete. The end comes in August 1305, not through glorious battle but through the basest form of betrayal. John Menteith, a Scottish knight who has sold his soul for English gold, lures Wallace to a meeting near Glasgow. Perhaps Menteith promises aid for a new uprising. Perhaps he offers intelligence about English troop movements. The exact details matter little. What matters is that William Wallace, exhausted by years of hiding, desperate for any chance to strike back at his enemies, walks into a trap that will cost him everything. When English soldiers surround him, Wallace's first instinct is to fight. But he is alone, outnumbered, and the years of constant flight have taken their toll. The giant who once strode across battlefields like a force of nature finds himself bound with chains, a prize to be delivered to his greatest enemy. The journey to London is designed as much for humiliation as transportation. Wallace is paraded through every major town, displayed like a captured beast for the entertainment of English crowds. Children throw stones at his cage, adults hurl filth and curses. Each mile takes him further from the land he fought to free, and closer to the agony that awaits. Edward Longshanks could have simply hanged Wallace and been done with it. A quick drop, a snapped neck, and Scotland's greatest hero would be silenced forever. But Edward is not interested in mere execution. He wants to craft a spectacle so horrific, so absolutely terrifying, that it will crush the spirit of resistance for generations to come. He wants every Scot who hears of Wallace's fate to understand the price of defying English rule. Westminster Hall, England's greatest seat of justice, provides the stage for Wallace's final performance. The hall itself is a monument to English power, its massive oak roof soaring nearly 100 feet overhead, its stone walls carved with the heraldic symbols of conquering kings. Here, surrounded by the physical manifestations of English authority, William Wallace faces his accusers. The charges read against him would be laughable if their consequences weren't so dire. Treason against King Edward, though Wallace has never sworn fealty to the English crown. Murder and robbery, though the men he killed were occupying soldiers, and the wealth he took was used to fund Scotland's liberation. Sacrilege, though his only sin was refusing to bow before false authority. When given the chance to speak, Wallace's response rings through the hall with the force of thunder. I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. I owe him no allegiance. He is not my king. The words seal his fate, though that fate was decided long before he entered the hall. The judges, their verdict predetermined, pronounce the sentence that will transform William Wallace from man to martyr, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Even in medieval England, renowned for its creative cruelty, this punishment represents the absolute pinnacle of judicial savagery, reserved exclusively for traitors, and exclusively for men, as the law deems it too indecent to inflict such torments on women. It is designed not merely to kill, but to destroy utterly. The condemned man will experience multiple deaths, each one more agonizing than the last, until nothing remains but scattered pieces for the ravens. The morning of August 23rd, 1305, dawns grey and oppressive. London has been buzzing with anticipation for days. Vendors hawk meat pies and ale to the gathering crowds. Nobles arrange for the best viewing positions. Children who should be at their lessons instead press forward for a glimpse of the famous prisoner. The bloodlust is palpable, a tangible thing that seems to thicken the very air. At Westminster Hall, Wallace is stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle, a crude sledge used for dragging heavy loads. The symbolism is deliberate. He is no longer a man deserving of basic dignity, but cargo to be transported to its destination. A rope is tied around his feet, and the other end fastened to a horse's harness. When the animal lurches forward, Wallace's body begins its final terrible journey through the streets of London. Every cobblestone becomes an instrument of torture. Wallace's flesh, already weakened by months of imprisonment, tears away in strips as he's dragged over the rough stones. His head bounces sickeningly against the ground. Blood streams from dozens of wounds, leaving a crimson trail that dogs eagerly lap up. The crowd follows like a diseased parade, their jeers and curses mixing with the scraping sound of flesh against stone. The procession winds through London's narrow streets for what seems like hours, past the great cathedral of St. Paul's, where priests cross themselves and look away, past the bustling markets, where merchants abandon their stalls to join the following mob, past the homes of nobles, who watch from their windows with expressions of fascination and revulsion. Wallace drifts in and out of consciousness, his body a symphony of agony, but still his lips move in what might be prayers, or might be curses. Smithfield, the execution ground, spreads before them like an amphitheatre of death. Known as the elms for the great trees that dot its expanse, it has witnessed countless executions over the centuries, but none quite like this. A platform has been erected in the centre of the field, surrounded by crude wooden barriers to keep the crowd at a manageable distance. Ropes and pulleys dangle from a wooden framework like the rigging of some hellish ship. Braziers burn hot and ready, their flames dancing with eager anticipation. The executioner waits beside his instruments, like a craftsman preparing for his masterpiece. He is a professional, chosen for his skill in prolonging life rather than ending it quickly. His job is not merely to kill William Wallace, but to orchestrate a performance of suffering that will be remembered for centuries. The first phase of the execution, the hanging, begins immediately. Wallace, barely conscious from his ordeal in the streets, is hauled upright and positioned beneath the gallows. A rough hemp rope, thick as a man's thumb, is looped around his neck with practiced efficiency. The crowd falls silent, their bloodlust temporarily satisfied by the anticipation of what's to come. But this is not the merciful hanging of ordinary criminals, where a swift drop snaps the neck and brings quick death. Instead, Wallace is slowly hoisted into the air until his feet dangle inches from the ground. The rope constricts around his throat like a living thing, cutting off his breath but not his circulation. His body convulses as it fights for air that will not come. His face turns purple, then blue, his eyes bulging from their sockets as pressure builds in his skull. The crowd watches in fascination as Wallace's powerful frame writhes and spasms. Some cheer each convulsion. Others place bets on how long he'll survive. Children, lifted onto their father's shoulders for a better view, point and laugh at the dancing man. Minutes pass, long, terrible minutes where Wallace hovers on the very edge of death, his brain starved of oxygen but his heart still beating. Just as unconsciousness begins to claim him, the executioner gives a signal. Wallace is lowered back to the platform, the rope loosened just enough to allow precious air back into his lungs. His body spasms as he gasps desperately, his chest heaving like a bellows. But there will be no rest, no merciful fade into darkness. The worst is yet to come. The second phase, the drawing, or disembowelment, begins while Wallace still struggles to breathe. Sharp knives flash in the morning sun as the executioner makes the first cuts. The blade slides beneath Wallace's ribs with surgical precision, opening his abdomen from sternum to pelvis. Blood pours onto the platform, creating crimson pools that steam in the cool air. Wallace's eyes snap open as the pain cuts through his semi-consciousness like lightning. A scream tries to tear from his throat, but the damaged larynx can produce only a strangled wheeze. His body arches against the ropes that bind him as the executioner reaches inside his body cavity with practiced hands. What follows defies every natural law of human endurance. The executioner, working with the methodical patience of a surgeon, begins removing Wallace's internal organs while he still lives. First the stomach, uncoiling like a grey snake as it's pulled from his body. Then the intestines, yard after yard of them glistening and steaming as they're dragged into the morning air. The crowd roars its approval as each organ is held high before being cast onto the waiting fires. The smell of burning flesh mingles with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke from the braziers. Many in the crowd cover their faces with cloth, but they do not look away. They cannot look away. This is spectacle beyond their wildest imaginings, a display of state power that reduces a man to his component parts while thousands watch and cheer. But even this is not the end of Wallace's ordeal. The final indignity, castration, awaits. The executioner's blade flashes once more, and Wallace's manhood is severed with a single, efficient cut. The crowd's roar reaches a fever pitch as the bloody trophy is held aloft before being thrown onto the flames. The symbolism is unmistakable. This is what becomes of those who would dare challenge English authority. Somehow, impossibly, Wallace still lives. His body, reduced to a hollow shell, continues to fight for each breath. His eyes, though clouded with pain and approaching death, still hold that spark of defiance that has carried him through years of struggle. Even now, even as his life ebbs away drop by drop, William Wallace refuses to break. The final act, the quartering, must wait until death finally claims him. But when it comes not with surrender but with something that might almost be called triumph. Wallace's lips move one final time, forming words that only he can hear. Perhaps it's a prayer, perhaps it's a curse upon his enemies, perhaps it's simply the name of the land he died trying to free, Scotland. When the great heart finally stops beating, the executioner steps forward to complete his grisly work. Sharp axes rise and fall with mechanical precision, separating Wallace's limbs from his torso with wet, meaty sounds that echo across the suddenly silent field. The head, that proud head that never bowed to English authority, is severed with a single stroke and held high for all to see. The crowd, sated at last by the spectacle they've witnessed, begins to disperse. But Wallace's journey is not yet over. His head, preserved in tar to prevent decay, is mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, the first head ever to decorate that famous crossing. His 4 limbs are dispatched to the corners of his homeland, one to Newcastle, one to Berwick, one to Stirling, and one to Perth. Each serves as a warning to any who might consider following Wallace's example. Edward Longshanks believes he has won the ultimate victory. The man who dared defy him has been not merely killed, but obliterated, his body scattered to the winds like dust. Surely, the king reasons, no one who witnesses such a fate would dare risk similar treatment. Surely the spirit of Scottish resistance has been crushed forever. But tyrants throughout history have never understood a fundamental truth about martyrdom. The death of the body can give birth to something far more powerful than any single man. Even as Wallace's remains rot on their spikes, something stirs in the Scottish heart. The brutality of his execution, rather than cowing the people into submission, awakens in them a fury that will burn for generations. Within months of Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce murders his rival John Comyn in a church and declares himself King of Scotland. The Wars of Independence, far from ending with Wallace's execution, enter a new and even more savage phase. At Loudon Hill, at Bannockburn, at a dozen other battlefields, Scottish warriors carry Wallace's name into battle like a banner. For Wallace becomes their war cry, and the sound of it strikes terror into English hearts. Edward Longshanks himself will never see Scotland subdued. He dies in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace's execution, his final words allegedly commanding his son to boil the flesh from his bones and carry them at the head of every English army until Scotland is conquered. But his son Edward II proves to be made of far weaker stuff than his legendary father. Under his ineffectual leadership, the English grip on Scotland loosens until it snaps entirely. The final irony comes in 1320, when Scottish nobles gather to sign the Declaration of Arbroath, perhaps the finest statement of national independence ever penned. Its words echo across the centuries with the same defiant spirit that William Wallace carried to his death. As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself. William Wallace never lived to see his dream of Scottish independence fulfilled, but his sacrifice planted the seeds that would eventually flower into freedom. His execution, intended as the ultimate demonstration of English power, instead became the catalyst for everything Edward Longshanks sought to prevent. In the end, Perhaps that is Wallace's true victory. The man who died in agony at Smithfield, his body torn apart and scattered to the winds, achieved through his death what he could not accomplish in life. He became immortal, not in flesh but in the undying spirit of a people who refused to bow to any master but their own choosing. Today, more than 7 centuries after that grey morning in London, William Wallace's name still stirs hearts and quickens pulses. His story has been told and retold, each generation finding in it the inspiration they need for their own struggles. The body that was so brutally destroyed has long since returned to dust, but the idea it represented, that freedom is worth any sacrifice, that some principles are worth dying for, burns as brightly as ever. Standing in modern-day Smithfield, watching the traffic flow past the memorial plaque that marks the spot where Wallace died, one cannot help but wonder what he would think of his legacy. Would he be pleased to know that his death sparked the very revolution he died trying to achieve? Would he be amazed to learn that his name is still spoken with reverence in the land he loved above his own life? Perhaps the answer lies not in speculation but in the simple fact that we still remember. In an age where fame is fleeting and heroes are quickly forgotten, William Wallace endures. His story continues to inspire those who face impossible odds, who stand alone against overwhelming power, who refuse to compromise their principles even when the cost is everything they hold dear. The brutal execution of William Wallace was meant to be the end of a story, the final chapter in the life of a troublesome rebel. Instead, it became the beginning of a legend that will outlive empires, a testament to the power of the human spirit to triumph even in defeat. In dying as he lived, unbroken, unbowed, and utterly defiant, William Wallace achieved the only victory that truly matters. He became immortal. And so the ghost of that tall man from Renfrewshire still walks among us, reminding us that some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. In every act of courage against overwhelming odds, in every stand taken for principle over convenience, in every refusal to bow to unjust authority, the spirit of William Wallace lives on. The body they quartered and scattered to the winds has long since returned to dust. But the dream he died for, the dream of freedom, burns eternal.